If you're hearing this exactly 5 years after I'm gone, Margaret, it means they've already started, Daniel had written in a steady hand that hadn't trembled even in his final weeks. The envelope had sat untouched on the mantel for nearly 24 hours, its cream paper thick and formal, the words "Open 5 years after my death" written across the front in ink she would have recognized anywhere. Margaret Whitmore had received it the evening before, not from the mail, but from Daniel's old attorney, who had arrived unannounced just as she was setting the table for dinner in the 3,200-square-foot colonial home she had lived in for 38 years. Ethan and Olivia had been there too, seated across from her at the mahogany table Daniel once polished every Sunday morning. The attorney had cleared his throat and placed the sealed envelope in front of her without ceremony, explaining that Daniel had left specific instructions for it to be delivered on the 5th anniversary of his death. Olivia's eyes had sharpened almost imperceptibly at the word anniversary, and Ethan had gone quiet in a way that reminded Margaret of him as a boy when he was caught between telling the truth and protecting someone else. Margaret had not opened it then. Instead, she had thanked the attorney, placed the envelope carefully beside the fireplace, and continued serving pot roast as if nothing in the room had shifted. But everything had shifted. For 5 years, Margaret had adjusted to a new rhythm of widowhood, one where her opinions about finances were gently dismissed and her access to certain documents was handled for her convenience. Olivia had often used that word, handled, when speaking about property taxes, insurance renewals, and investment accounts. Margaret had allowed it, telling herself that young families had their own pressures, that Ethan was busy managing his software consulting firm, that trust was the foundation of any family. Yet she had noticed small things. The way Olivia lingered when conversations turned to equity in the house, the way Ethan deflected when Margaret asked about Daniel's original estate plans, the subtle shift from "Mom, what do you think?" to "Mom, we've already decided." That night, after Ethan and Olivia left, Margaret had stood in the quiet living room, staring at the envelope resting beneath the framed photograph of Daniel smiling in a navy blazer by the lake house they once rented. Every summer, she had felt no panic, only a slow, steady tightening in her chest, not from grief but from recognition. Daniel had always planned 3 steps ahead. He had built his small manufacturing business from a garage into a company that employed 60 people. He had never trusted chance, and he had never trusted silence. Now, on a crisp October morning exactly 5 years after she buried him under a cloudless Midwestern sky, Margaret sat alone in his old study. The leather chair still carried the faint scent of his cologne. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes across the desk, where he used to balance spreadsheets by hand. She ran her fingers over the edge of the envelope before finally breaking the seal with deliberate care. The paper inside unfolded with a soft crackle. Daniel's handwriting filled the page, steady and unmistakable. As her eyes moved over the first line, Margaret realized this was not a love letter, nor a simple farewell. It was a warning and possibly a map, and for the first time in 5 years, she understood that her late husband had not left her unprotected after all. Margaret read the letter twice before she allowed herself to breathe normally again. Daniel's words were calm, precise, and unmistakably deliberate. He did not accuse. He did not dramatize. He simply laid out observations he had made in the final year of his life, patterns he believed would become clearer with time. He wrote that if she was holding this letter, it meant she had endured 5 years without his protection, and that during those years certain conversations about property, equity, and restructuring would likely have increased. He urged her not to confront anyone immediately. Instead, he advised her to observe. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk, her movements steady. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 5 years had passed since Daniel's funeral. 5 years of adjusting to a home that felt both too large and subtly unfamiliar. After Daniel died, Ethan had insisted on helping with the finances. At first, Margaret had been grateful. Grief had blurred her focus, and the stack of documents from the estate had felt overwhelming. Olivia had offered to organize everything into labeled binders, smiling gently as she explained that it would be easier for Margaret not to worry about investment allocations or tax filings. Margaret had accepted the help, telling herself that this was what families did. But gradually, the updates became summaries instead of discussions. Statements were delivered with conclusions already decided. When Margaret asked about the original structure of Daniel's holdings, Ethan would reassure her that nothing significant had changed. Olivia would nod and add that modernizing certain accounts was simply good planning. Margaret remembered the afternoon she had tried to access the small safe in Daniel's study and discovered that the code no longer worked. Ethan had apologized, saying he changed it after installing a new security system and had forgotten to tell her. She had believed him, or at least she had chosen to. Daniel's letter mentioned that very safe. He wrote that a separate trust existed, established quietly 2 years before his passing, one that could not be altered without Margaret's explicit written consent. He warned her that if pressure ever mounted to refinance the house or consolidate assets into joint accounts, she should pause. Margaret rose from the desk and walked slowly into the living room, where the envelope had rested the night before. The morning light revealed dust she had not noticed before along the baseboards. Small things were easier to see once one decided to look. Her mind drifted to recent conversations. Olivia had mentioned rising property taxes 3 times in the past month. Ethan had suggested that downsizing might simplify Margaret's life. They had spoken about efficiency, about practicality, about how much easier everything would be if the house were sold and the proceeds reinvested under their guidance. Margaret had nodded each time, offering no resistance. Now, standing in the center of the home she had shared with Daniel for nearly 4 decades, she understood that the letter was not merely information. It was instruction, and for the first time since becoming a widow, she felt something unfamiliar returning to her posture, something steadier than grief and sharper than doubt. She would not rush. She would not accuse. She would watch, exactly as Daniel had advised. Margaret did not change her routine the next morning. She brewed her coffee at exactly 7:30, measured 2 tablespoons of grounds the way Daniel had taught her, and carried the mug into the kitchen nook that overlooked the backyard. The maple tree along the fence had begun to lose its leaves, scattering red and gold across the trimmed grass. For 5 years, she had watched those seasons change without questioning the quiet adjustments happening inside her own home. Now she listened differently. By mid-morning, Ethan called, his voice warm but slightly hurried. He asked if she had opened the envelope. Margaret answered truthfully that she had. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before he asked what Daniel had written. She told him it was mostly personal reflections. She did not elaborate. Ethan responded with a soft exhale that sounded almost like relief. Later that afternoon, Olivia arrived without calling first. She carried a folder tucked neatly under her arm and wore the same polite expression she reserved for neighbors and bank representatives. She asked gently how Margaret was holding up after reading something so emotional. Margaret noticed the way Olivia's gaze drifted toward the hallway leading to Daniel's study. It was subtle, but it lingered a second too long. Margaret invited her to sit at the dining table. Olivia opened the folder and began explaining that interest rates had shifted again and that this might be the ideal time to refinance the property, freeing up equity for what she described as smarter growth. She spoke in smooth, confident sentences, outlining projected returns and tax efficiencies as if presenting a well-rehearsed case. Margaret listened without interruption. She folded her hands on the table and nodded occasionally, asking a simple question about closing costs, then another about prepayment penalties. Olivia answered quickly, almost too quickly, as if she had prepared for objections that never came. When Ethan joined them after work, he echoed Olivia's reasoning. He spoke about security, about ensuring Margaret would never have to worry about monthly expenses again. The house, he suggested, was an asset that should be working for the family. Margaret glanced at the framed photographs lining the wall, images of birthdays, graduations, and summer barbecues. For decades, the house had worked by holding memories, by providing steadiness. She thanked them both for their concern and said she needed time to think. There was another pause, longer this time. Olivia closed the folder carefully, her smile tightening at the corners. As they prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the front door. Ethan hugged her lightly, asking her to trust them. She told him she always had. After the door shut, Margaret remained standing in the foyer, listening to their car pull out of the driveway. The quiet returned, but it felt different now, not empty but charged. She walked back to Daniel's study and reopened the letter, rereading the section where he advised patience above all else. Observe how urgency increases when resistance appears, he had written. Margaret folded the paper once more and placed it inside a drawer beneath the desk. She had no intention of confronting them yet. Instead, she would let the urgency rise exactly as Daniel predicted. The following week unfolded with a quiet predictability that only sharpened Margaret's awareness. She kept her schedule unchanged, attending her Tuesday book club at the community center and volunteering Thursday morning at the local library, shelving return novels with steady hands. Outwardly, nothing in her routine suggested concern. Inwardly, she measured tone, timing, and frequency. By Wednesday evening, Ethan called again, this time mentioning that the bank representative who handled many of his company accounts would be happy to stop by and explain the refinancing process in person. Margaret thanked him and said she appreciated how attentive he was. She added that she was still reflecting on what was best. The next day, Olivia sent an email summarizing projected numbers in clean, organized columns. The message emphasized opportunity windows and potential savings over a 30-year horizon. Margaret read it twice, noting how often the phrase family benefit appeared. She printed the email and placed it beside Daniel's letter on the desk, aligning the edges neatly. Daniel had written that pressure often arrived disguised as generosity. As the days passed, Margaret allowed small delays. She did not respond to every message immediately. She asked for clarification about minor details such as appraisal fees and lender disclosures. Each request was polite and measured. The responses grew slightly more urgent. Ethan stopped by Saturday afternoon carrying brochures from 2 senior living communities located within 15 miles of her home. He spoke about maintenance-free living and social activities, about how much lighter her responsibilities could be. Margaret listened while pouring iced tea into tall glasses, the condensation sliding down the sides onto coasters Daniel once carved by hand. She noticed that Ethan's reassurances were increasingly framed around ease, around how much simpler it would be if the house were no longer in her name alone. Olivia arrived shortly after, praising the idea of reducing risk exposure in an uncertain market. The language was confident, almost rehearsed. Margaret asked a single question about the timeline. Olivia answered that acting before the end of the quarter would be ideal. The word ideal lingered in the air longer than necessary. That evening, after they left, Margaret returned to the study and opened the drawer where Daniel's letter rested. She reread the paragraph about the trust he had established quietly years before his passing. He had written that it was structured to remain insulated from external restructuring unless she personally authorized changes in writing, with independent legal counsel present. He emphasized that any sudden enthusiasm to alter ownership should be examined carefully. Margaret closed the drawer and stood by the window overlooking the driveway. The porch light illuminated the empty concrete, where Ethan's car had been parked only minutes earlier. For 5 years, she had interpreted their involvement as devotion. Now she saw a different pattern, not loud or dramatic, but persistent and directional. She felt no anger, only clarity settling into place like a final puzzle piece. She would meet the bank representative if necessary. She would tour a senior living community if asked. She would continue to nod and consider. And while they measured timelines and projections, she would quietly arrange her own meeting, one that Daniel had anticipated long before any of them realized it. On Monday morning, Margaret dressed with deliberate care, choosing a tailored navy blazer Daniel once said made her look composed in any room. She scheduled an appointment with Thomas Reynolds, the attorney who had delivered the envelope, requesting a private consultation at his downtown office. The building stood 12 stories tall with glass windows reflecting the autumn sky, and as she stepped inside, she felt neither nervous nor hesitant. She carried a slim leather folder containing Daniel's letter and the printed email from Olivia. Thomas greeted her with quiet respect and guided her into a conference room overlooking the city streets below. Margaret placed the letter on the polished table between them and asked him to confirm every detail Daniel had referenced. Thomas listened without interruption, then opened a secure file cabinet and retrieved a thick document bound with a navy ribbon. He explained that Daniel had established an irrevocable trust 2 years before his death, structured specifically to protect the primary residence and a significant portion of liquid assets from unauthorized restructuring. The trust required Margaret's written consent, notarized independently, before any refinancing, sale, or consolidation could occur. Furthermore, any attempt to alter ownership without her informed participation would automatically trigger legal safeguards preventing transfer for a minimum of 10 additional years. Margaret did not smile, but a subtle steadiness returned to her shoulders. She asked whether anyone else had requested documentation related to the property. Thomas hesitated only briefly before confirming that an inquiry had been made 3 months earlier regarding potential valuation estimates, though no formal request had been approved. Margaret absorbed the information calmly. She thanked him and asked that all future communications regarding the trust be directed to her personal email and mailed directly to her home address, not through intermediaries. Thomas assured her that Daniel had anticipated precisely this need for discretion. As she left the office and stepped onto the sidewalk, traffic moved steadily along the avenue, unaware of the quiet shift occurring within her. That afternoon, Ethan called again, mentioning that the bank representative was available later in the week. Margaret told him she would be pleased to meet and listen. Her tone remained warm, unchanged. When Olivia followed with a message emphasizing how quickly interest rates could rise, Margaret replied that timing was important and she agreed that careful planning mattered. She did not reveal her meeting with Thomas. That evening she returned to Daniel's study and unlocked the safe using the updated code Thomas had discreetly provided during their consultation. Inside, alongside old warranty papers and a faded baseball ticket stub from a game they attended decades ago, lay a sealed packet labeled Supplemental Instructions. Margaret did not open it yet. Instead, she closed the safe gently and sat in Daniel's leather chair, allowing the quiet room to settle around her. For the first time in years, she felt that she was not reacting, but preparing. The urgency she had observed was no longer unsettling. It was confirming. Daniel had not left her alone in this house, filled with echoes. He had left structure, boundaries, and time. And as the week moved forward toward the scheduled bank meeting, Margaret understood that patience was no longer a passive act. It was strategy. The meeting with the bank representative was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Margaret prepared for it the same way she once prepared for school conferences when Ethan was a child, with quiet attention and a notebook placed neatly beside her purse. The representative, a man in his early 40s with a polished manner and careful smile, arrived carrying a tablet and a leather portfolio embossed with the bank's logo. Ethan greeted him warmly, as though this were a partnership already decided. Olivia arranged printed projections across the dining table, aligning the pages with deliberate precision. Margaret took her usual seat at the head of the table. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long lines across the polished wood Daniel had refinished himself decades earlier. The representative began outlining loan structures, adjustable rate options, and projected appreciation curves based on current market trends. He spoke of opportunity, of unlocking capital, of ensuring the property was positioned to support the next generation. Margaret listened without interruption, her pen resting lightly between her fingers. When the presentation paused, she asked him to clarify whether any restructuring would require direct authorization from the property owner. He replied that all legal documentation would need her signature. She nodded and asked whether independent counsel was recommended before proceeding. The representative hesitated only briefly before acknowledging that independent review was always advisable. Olivia interjected smoothly, suggesting that such steps were unnecessary given their family trust. Margaret smiled politely and wrote one more note in her notebook. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with numbers and timelines laid carefully across the table like pieces in a quiet negotiation. Margaret never raised her voice. She did not reject the proposal. She simply said she would need several days to review the documents thoroughly. Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a faint tightening around his eyes that she had not seen since he was a teenager awaiting consequences. Olivia gathered the papers with practiced calm, assuring Margaret that timing mattered and that delay could reduce benefits. Margaret agreed that timing always mattered. After they left, she returned to Daniel's study and reopened the safe. This time she retrieved the packet labeled Supplemental Instructions and broke its seal. Inside she found detailed documentation of the trust's protective clauses, including a provision that automatically nullified any refinancing attempt made without full disclosure of the trust's existence. Daniel had anticipated the possibility of persuasive pressure rather than confrontation. Margaret placed the documents neatly beside the earlier letter and allowed herself a slow exhale. The urgency she had observed was becoming more pronounced, but it no longer unsettled her. It confirmed what Daniel had foreseen. She would attend every meeting they scheduled. She would listen to every projection and promise. And when the moment arrived to sign, she would not refuse with anger. She would respond with documentation. In the quiet of the study, surrounded by decades of shared history, Margaret understood that patience had given her clarity. And clarity, she realized, was stronger than any raised voice. By Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere inside the house had shifted again, though no one acknowledged it directly. Ethan arrived earlier than usual, without calling ahead, carrying a slim document envelope that looked too formal for a casual visit. Olivia followed a few minutes later, her expression composed but alert, as if she were entering a meeting rather than her mother-in-law's home. Margaret welcomed them inside with the same calm courtesy she had always shown. She offered coffee, set 3 cups on the dining table, and waited. Ethan cleared his throat and explained that the bank required preliminary authorization forms to begin the refinancing review process. He emphasized that signing did not commit her to anything permanent. It merely allowed the analysis to move forward. Olivia added that delaying further might close the opportunity window entirely. Margaret studied the envelope without touching it. She noticed that neither of them mentioned independent legal counsel this time. She asked a single question about whether the analysis assumed sole ownership of the property. Ethan replied that technically the house was in her name, but restructuring would provide greater flexibility for the family overall. The word flexibility lingered in the air. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and said she appreciated how proactive they were. She then excused herself briefly and walked to Daniel's study. She did not hurry. She opened the safe and removed a copy of the trust summary Thomas had provided, along with a printed page highlighting the clause regarding unauthorized restructuring attempts. She returned to the dining table and placed the document beside the unopened envelope. Ethan's expression shifted as he recognized the legal formatting. Olivia's posture straightened slightly. Margaret explained in a steady voice that Daniel had established protections requiring her informed and independent consent before any refinancing or transfer could be initiated. She did not accuse them of anything improper. She simply stated that, given these provisions, she would not authorize any preliminary steps without her attorney present. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Ethan looked at Olivia, then back at his mother. He asked quietly when she had learned about the trust. Margaret answered that she had always trusted Daniel to plan carefully. Olivia maintained her composed smile, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope. She suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about ownership structures. Margaret replied that clarity was important and that all future discussions would include Thomas Reynolds. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, only documentation resting on polished wood. After a moment, Ethan nodded and gathered the envelope without opening it. He said they would revisit the conversation later. Margaret walked them to the door, her movements measured. As their car pulled away, she remained standing on the porch, feeling neither triumph nor anger. Inside the quiet house, the air felt different again, not tense but settled. She returned to the dining table and aligned the trust document neatly with the grain of the wood. The urgency had surfaced exactly as Daniel predicted. And now, without a single accusation spoken, the direction of the conversation had begun to change. The following week moved with a restrained quiet that felt almost deliberate. Ethan did not call for 2 days, which in itself was unusual. Olivia sent no emails, no updated projections, no reminders about rate changes or timing windows. Margaret noticed the silence the way one notices the absence of a ticking clock. It did not alarm her. It confirmed adjustment. On Wednesday afternoon her phone rang, and Ethan's voice carried a different tone, less confident, more cautious. He asked if she would consider meeting again, this time simply to clear up misunderstandings. Margaret agreed, suggesting they gather on Saturday morning. When they arrived, there was no envelope in Ethan's hand, no glossy brochures. Olivia wore a softer expression, her posture less assertive than before. They sat in the living room rather than at the dining table, as though rearranging the setting might ease the conversation. Ethan began by explaining that they had not realized Daniel had structured the estate so specifically. He said they believed they were acting in everyone's best interest. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting loosely on her lap. She did not contradict him. She did not accuse. She simply asked whether they had been aware of the inquiry made to the attorney's office regarding property valuation months earlier. Ethan looked toward Olivia, then back at his mother, and admitted that he had requested a general estimate out of curiosity. Olivia added that it was only research, nothing formal. Margaret nodded, accepting the explanation without expression. She then explained that any future discussions about the house would occur with full transparency and with her legal counsel present. She emphasized that this was not a rejection of their involvement, but a clarification of structure. The distinction was subtle but firm. Olivia attempted a gentle pivot, suggesting that perhaps downsizing could still be beneficial even without refinancing. Margaret replied that she would consider all options in her own time. The phrase "in her own time" settled into the room like a boundary line. The conversation lasted less than 30 minutes. When Ethan stood to leave, he hesitated before hugging his mother. The embrace felt familiar, yet something underneath it had shifted. After the door closed, Margaret remained seated in the quiet living room. Sunlight filtered across the rug Daniel had purchased on a trip to Santa Fe years ago. She thought about how easily urgency had softened once documentation entered the conversation. Pressure did not disappear, it adapted. That evening she returned to Daniel's study and reviewed the supplemental instructions once more. There was a final note written in smaller script at the bottom of the page. If they retreat quickly, observe whether the direction changes rather than the intention. Margaret folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the safe. She understood now that this was not about a single refinancing proposal. It was about positioning, and she intended to remain precisely where Daniel had left her, informed, deliberate, and no longer one step behind. 2 days after their last conversation, a thin white envelope arrived in Margaret's mailbox bearing the return address of a regional lending office. She stood at the kitchen counter holding it for a long moment before opening it with a letter opener Daniel had once kept on his desk. Inside was a courteous notice thanking her for her recent inquiry regarding property evaluation and inviting her to complete the next steps to expedite processing. Margaret read the letter twice. She had made no inquiry. She placed the document flat against the granite countertop and reached for her phone. Instead of calling Ethan, she contacted Thomas Reynolds. Within an hour she was seated once again in his downtown office, the envelope resting between them. Thomas adjusted his glasses and reviewed the notice carefully. He explained that preliminary online submissions could trigger automated responses even without full authorization. But he also noted that certain information required access to property identification numbers and ownership details not typically available without family involvement. Margaret listened without visible reaction. She asked him to verify whether any digital pre-application had been filed under her name. Thomas made a brief call to a colleague and returned with confirmation that a valuation request had indeed been logged using her address, though no formal refinancing had progressed due to missing signature verification. Margaret absorbed the information in silence. The direction had changed, exactly as Daniel suggested it might. The next evening Ethan stopped by unannounced. His expression was unsettled, not defensive but strained. He admitted that he had explored valuation estimates online out of curiosity, and that perhaps an automated form had advanced further than he intended. He insisted there had been no malicious intent. Olivia arrived shortly after, echoing the explanation and suggesting that digital systems sometimes moved quickly without clear consent. Margaret did not challenge them. She walked to Daniel's study and returned with a copy of the trust summary once more, placing it calmly on the coffee table. She explained that even exploratory submissions could create misunderstandings and that all future financial inquiries would require her direct authorization and attorney oversight. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. Ethan nodded, though his shoulders seemed heavier than before. Olivia's composure flickered briefly before settling again into practiced calm. They apologized for any confusion and promised to refrain from further action without discussion. Margaret accepted the apology without dramatics. After they left, she stood by the window watching their car disappear down the quiet suburban street lined with maple trees and evenly spaced mailboxes. The house felt still, but not vulnerable. She returned to the kitchen and placed the lender's letter beside Daniel's original envelope, aligning them carefully. Patterns no longer felt abstract. They were documented. Daniel had not written warnings fueled by suspicion. He had written instructions grounded in foresight. Margaret folded the lender's letter and added it to the file she now kept in the safe. She did not feel anger. She felt confirmation. And confirmation, she realized, required no raised voice to be understood. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. Margaret did not mention the lender's letter again, and neither did Ethan or Olivia. Instead, their approach shifted toward gentler persuasion. Ethan began stopping by in the evenings with small gestures of thoughtfulness, bringing fresh groceries or offering to handle minor repairs around the house. Olivia sent articles about market volatility and retirement planning, each accompanied by reassuring notes about security and long-term stability. Margaret received every gesture with quiet gratitude. She thanked them sincerely and continued her routines without alteration. What changed was not her schedule, but her preparation. On Tuesday morning, she returned to Thomas Reynolds with a request that surprised even herself. She asked to draft a formal notice clarifying that all financial inquiries regarding the property must include written authorization directly from her and must acknowledge the existing trust in full. Thomas reviewed the language carefully, ensuring it was firm without being confrontational. Margaret signed the document in his office and instructed him to file it with the appropriate institutions. There was no urgency in her movements, only steadiness. Later that week, she invited Ethan and Olivia to dinner. The invitation was simple, delivered by phone in her usual warm tone. When they arrived, the dining table was set with her best china, the same pattern she and Daniel had chosen during their first year of marriage. The meal unfolded calmly. Conversation drifted from Ethan's business updates to neighborhood news. Margaret allowed the evening to feel normal before she reached into a slim folder beside her chair. She placed 3 copies of the formal notice on the table, aligning them neatly. Ethan glanced down first, recognizing legal formatting immediately. Olivia followed, her expression composed but watchful. Margaret explained that clarity prevented misunderstandings and that she believed this step would protect everyone involved. She emphasized that it was not an accusation but a safeguard. Ethan read the document slowly. The language was unmistakable. Any attempt to initiate property valuation, refinancing, or restructuring without her explicit written consent and attorney oversight would be considered unauthorized. Olivia set her copy down carefully and assured Margaret that such formalities were unnecessary among family. Margaret responded that transparency strengthened family trust. The conversation did not escalate. There were no raised voices, only a quiet recognition that the parameters had shifted permanently. After dinner, Ethan lingered in the hallway before leaving, asking if she truly believed they would act against her interests. Margaret answered that she believed in structure. When the door closed behind them, she stood alone in the soft glow of the porch light filtering through the sidelights. The house did not feel defensive. It felt defined. She returned to Daniel's study and placed a copy of the signed notice inside the safe beside the growing file of documentation. Daniel had written that preparation was the difference between reacting and deciding. Margaret understood that now. She was no longer waiting for urgency to rise. She had drawn the boundary quietly, and the boundary was legal, documented, and unmistakable. The following morning, Margaret woke before sunrise, the house wrapped in a pale blue quiet that felt almost ceremonial. She brewed her coffee and carried it into Daniel's study, sitting in the leather chair that had slowly molded to her shape over the past 5 years. On the desk lay a small stack of documents she had reviewed the night before, including an updated statement from the trust and a copy of the formal notice now filed with financial institutions. She had not expected what happened next, but she recognized it immediately when it arrived. At 8:15, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of the regional lending office. Margaret answered calmly. The representative on the line spoke in a measured tone, explaining that an additional inquiry had been submitted online regarding a potential home equity adjustment, but that the request had been automatically suspended due to a recently filed restriction notice. He asked whether she wished to authorize any review. Margaret thanked him for contacting her directly and confirmed that she had not initiated any such inquiry. She requested written confirmation of the suspension for her records. Within the hour, the confirmation arrived in her email inbox. Margaret printed it and placed it neatly atop the existing file. By late afternoon, Ethan appeared at her front door, his expression no longer cautious but strained. Olivia stood beside him, her composure intact but thinner than before. Ethan admitted that he had explored another scenario after discussing long-term business expansion plans, and that he believed he could manage the process discreetly. He said he did not anticipate the automatic notification triggered by the legal notice. Margaret listened without interruption. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of betrayal. She simply walked to Daniel's study and returned with the email confirmation from the lender. She placed it gently on the dining table between them. The paper spoke without emotion. Olivia's eyes scanned the page quickly, and for a moment her confidence faltered. Ethan exhaled slowly, understanding that the boundary was no longer theoretical. Margaret explained that structure protected everyone, including him. She reminded him that trust did not replace documentation. The conversation remained controlled, but something beneath it had shifted permanently. Ethan asked if she intended to involve legal consequences. Margaret answered that she intended only clarity and compliance. She would not pursue conflict unless forced to. The distinction was precise. After a long pause, Ethan apologized, not dramatically, but with the weight of realization settling into his voice. Olivia remained quiet. When they left, the air inside the house felt lighter, not triumphant, but resolved. Margaret returned to Daniel's study and added the printed confirmation to the safe. She closed the heavy door and turned the dial slowly until it clicked into place. Daniel had written that foresight would eventually surface intention. It had, and Margaret now understood that the true confrontation had not required anger or accusation. It had required preparedness, patience, and the quiet strength to let documentation speak where emotion once might have. The house felt different in the weeks that followed, not because anything inside it had changed, but because the uncertainty had settled into something clear and defined. Ethan did not attempt another inquiry. Olivia did not send projections or articles about market timing. Their visits became less frequent at first, then more measured, as if each interaction required careful consideration. Margaret did not restrict access to her home. She did not withdraw affection. Instead, she maintained the same steady presence she had always offered, but now without yielding authority. One crisp Saturday morning, she invited Ethan to walk with her through the backyard. The maple tree near the fence had nearly shed its leaves, and the air carried the quiet scent of early winter. They walked slowly along the stone path Daniel had laid by hand decades earlier. Margaret spoke calmly about legacy, about the difference between inheritance and control. She explained that the trust was not designed to punish anyone, but to protect stability across time. Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time in years, he did not argue about opportunity or efficiency. He asked instead whether she believed he had acted out of greed. Margaret paused before answering. She told him she believed he had acted out of pressure and ambition, not malice, but that ambition without boundaries could erode trust quietly. The distinction mattered. Later that week, she met with Thomas Reynolds one final time to update beneficiary designations within the trust, ensuring that future distributions would prioritize long-term balance rather than immediate consolidation. The changes were subtle but firm. When she informed Ethan of the adjustments, she did so plainly, without accusation. She told him that clarity removed confusion. Olivia remained courteous but reserved, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful distance. Margaret did not interpret the distance as hostility. She interpreted it as recognition. One evening, as she sat alone in Daniel's study, she removed the original letter from the safe and read it once more. The ink had not faded. The foresight had not weakened. Daniel had not left her instructions to create conflict. He had left her tools to preserve steadiness. Margaret folded the letter carefully and returned it to its place among the documented safeguards and updated papers. She closed the safe and turned the dial slowly until it locked. The house felt solid around her, not because it was protected by clauses and notices, but because she had reclaimed her role within it. Daniel's absence no longer felt like vulnerability. It felt like preparation fulfilled. Margaret turned off the study lamp and walked through the quiet hallway toward the front door, where the porch light cast a warm glow across the driveway. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No voices had been raised. Yet something irreversible had shifted. The boundaries were clear, the documentation secure, and the authority unmistakably hers. And in that quiet resolution, she understood that the true inheritance Daniel had left her was not simply property. It was foresight, dignity, and the calm strength to stand exactly where she belonged.